Hello and welcome to a God TV special with extraordinary guest, known and loved by God TV viewers, Annie Chikhwaza. Annie's the founder of Kondanani in Malawi, described as a 5-star orphanage, and the subject of a book by Al Gibson, Mother of Malawi. The jacket of the book describes Annie's story in this way. Annie is tough. She's overcome molestation, divorce, carjacking, a broken back, attempted murder, attempted rape, and the death of her beloved husband. Yet she has a vision and will not be deflected. This is her story. Wow, Annie, and some story. I read that in one sitting yesterday. And it sounds as though this all started just with a simple, caring heart of a young girl.
Yeah, I think when I was young, I just loved the people who were sidelined. And some of those people were the people who came to the village. You know, I lived in a small village, only 3,000 people, but we had this canal going through the village, and it was loading and offloading and all that kind of thing. And the children on those boats, they were considered kind of gypsies, and they were very dirty. They definitely weren't clean. And because they weren't clean, we were not allowed to associate with them. But just because of that, of course, I felt that I wanted to associate with them, because I didn't, you know, it would break my heart if nobody wanted them. And I mean, a child being put aside is very lonely, and I wanted to be part of their lives. And my mother didn't like that too much.
So what did you do? How did you go out to them?
Well, I would just go and befriend them. And after school, I would go to their homes, and I would clean up the place. And you know, I don't know what they thought of me. Honestly, Liz, I don't know what they thought of me. But I would clean up the place, and then I would go home again.
That's extraordinary. What sort of age were you, Annie?
Man, I was even 8 or 9.
I mean, that is extraordinary for a young girl to have such a heart of care for sidelined people, really, the marginalised.
Yeah.
But early on, you went through quite a trauma. You went through a dark period where you were abused both by a family friend and subsequently by a hospital chaplain. Now, what does that sort of thing do to you? How does it impact you?
You know, I was thinking about it actually this morning, and how I was going to kind of put this across, because I remember it very clearly, the abuse, the sexual abuse. And how does one respond to that when it is actually happening? And I think what happens is that you feel you don't want to embarrass this person. They're they're very wrong in their actions, but especially when it's a family friend. How do you approach it? You, yourself as a child, feel that you don't want to embarrass this person, so you keep quiet. I mean, it was years after that before I shared this kind of thing with my mother. It was years afterwards. But obviously it had an effect on me, and it made me feel dirty, it made me feel bad, but yet I didn't want to embarrass.
You wanted to cover up
I wanted to cover up. Yes.
And did that come out at all in the kind of person you were growing up to be, your behaviour?
I think, you know, I was quite a wild child.
Were you?
Yeah, I was a very naughty child. I was a very difficult child. And I think all of that had its roots in that. You know, a feeling I never felt good about myself.
Sure.
So because I didn't feel good about myself, I was naughty. You know, it expressed itself in my behavior. And again, then I had my mother having to deal with 5 children in a poverty situation. She would tell me that no good was ever going to come out of me.
Wow.
So it just rolled.
Yeah.
And my lack of self-esteem was rather bad. It was bad. It was very bad.
Well, it sounds in the book as though you began maybe to recover some of the sense of that when you started work as a psychiatric nurse. But there was more trouble to follow, more trauma as you walked in on the suicide of one of your patients. How do you cope with that? You were, what, 15?
You know what? Yeah, it was so difficult at home that my parents decided that we couldn't get this girl out of the house. Now, I need to say that when my mother had grown old, she desperately wanted my forgiveness for that. But by then, I'd got past it.
Sure.
And I was, in the month I turned 16, I went to work in a psychiatric hospital. At that time, that was allowed. And then you'd go to where the patients went for therapy during the day. You would do that for a year. And then you would go into training when you were 17. And I went there in the month I turned 16. I went on the 1st of May, and the 26th of May I turned 16. So I went into this terrible situation to the pavilion where the worst insane people were.
Wow.
And I remember we went to fetch the patients to go to the therapy, and the first thing I heard from one patient was, "Oh, you dirty prostitute, what are you doing here?" That was the first words. I thought, okay, never mind, she doesn't know what she's saying. And I actually loved the people. I loved them. I really loved them. Because again, they were people, I suppose.
Marginalized people.
Yes. And I just loved them. But my self-esteem, when I was 17, I was transferred to another pavilion. And we had to serve, on a Tuesday, we had to serve the doctors who had a gathering. We'd have to serve them tea. For me, I would cry and cry beforehand. And when I'd come out of there, I was like devastated because I thought they'd now be talking about me.
Oh, really?
I was under paranoia.
Wow.
And I would listen on the door of the sister. I think they were talking about me. They didn't even think about me. But this paranoia and being surrounded with it actually made me worse. But anyway, I enjoyed my colleagues. My room always had lots of coffee, so I had always lots of colleagues in my room. I enjoyed the nursing part of it.
Enjoyed caring for people.
I enjoyed the caring. I enjoyed especially the oldies who had Alzheimer's and, would dress up in all the wrong clothing and, or weren't dressed up at all.
Yeah.
And I would just love them and sit on their bed and sing for them. And, I just loved that.
And what happened with the patient?
But then I had
committed
one
suicide?
patient, and I remember her so clearly going through menopause. And that is why she was at this particular pavilion, and she was in severe depression. And we were sitting playing games one evening, and she said to me, "Sister, I'm going to bed." And I said, "Okay, good night, but I'll just see you just now." And probably 5 minutes later, I went into the ward and couldn't see her in the bed. And I went into the toilet. And we had these old-fashioned toilets with the cistern right at the top. And they must have been very strong because she'd actually hung herself on the cistern. And I was, as young as I was, but I was fast. I got her off there. I got everybody to come. I still remember the doctor saying, "Wow, you've got lots of, you've got strong lungs," because I would, blow into her mouth. But she was gone. She was gone. And I was devastated by that. And after that, as I would have to go and, check everywhere in the wards, in the clothing cupboards, which were dark. And, I just couldn't check anywhere anymore because it was like this spirit of suicide had got a hold of me as well.
Do you mean you wanted to end your life?
Yes, then I wanted to end my life. And then I had another situation just shortly after that when one of my patients, again my patient, had managed to climb out of a window above the door. And I knew he had hallucinations, and he was told, you know, by these voices to kill himself. And it took hours and hours and hours. And all I could see was this man hanging in a tree. And actually he came back the following morning at 5 o'clock and said, well, he realized the police was going to be everywhere, so he didn't have a chance to kill himself. But that had such a devastating effect on me that I then totally became suicidal myself. And I then started doing all sorts of things to try and get rid of myself. I cut, the marks are on my arms. I took tablets. I even broke the thermometer so I could eat the quicksilver because that was supposed to give me kidney infection, and that would, or kidney poisoning, and that would kill me. I did all sorts of things. But after I'd had a big pot of luminol, and was 5 days unconscious, the doctor said to me, he said, Annie, God has got a plan with your life.
Wow.
I'll never forget that. And of course I didn't believe him at the time, but those were his words, and I've never forgotten those words.
And it wasn't long after that, was it? You went to a really significant meeting with Brother Andrew.
Yeah, what happened was I was totally out of control by now. So they wanted to put me into a psychiatric hospital.
Yourself?
Yes. So in the meantime, I was locked up in a room in my parents' house, just for, you know, in case I did something else. Yeah. And I had a cousin. She's been in Thailand for 35 years. But at that time, she was a nursing sister. And because she was a nursing sister, she was allowed to take me to this meeting of Brother Andrew. And I went with, and it was the most amazing thing for me. And of course, the highlight of my life, that I know nothing about the preaching, absolutely zero. But when he stood on the stage, and I remember he stood on that side of the stage, and when he said, if you want to come to Jesus, if you want to ask Jesus into your life, at that point of time, Jesus stood on the other side, with his arms wide open. And boy, did I take a run for it, right into his arms. That encounter with God changed my life and set me free.
Were you totally free from any further suicidal thoughts, self-harming, everything?
There was still, in the beginning, there was still an inclination, but I had had this encounter.
Yeah.
And the encounter in my life became stronger than the inclination. And it didn't take long before I started going to the youth group in Amsterdam, which was a very, very good youth group. And we had revival there, and we had solid teaching there. And we were on the street from day one, preaching the gospel, going into the dark parts of Amsterdam. Our whole mission was to bring people to Jesus. Mm. And that is what I grew up in spiritually.
Yeah.
So I didn't know anything else. I thought everybody, actually, every Christian went onto the streets to preach the gospel. I remember that we didn't even think I didn't see anything wrong in anybody. I thought everybody was perfect. It was an amazing experience being in that youth group.
Well, you saw people the way God sees people, I guess.
I did.
And
it was God's way of seeing them.
Absolutely. And still this principle of care for people at work in you. Yeah. Because it wasn't long after that, it sounds, that you met and married your first husband. You went out to Johannesburg with him when his work moved. And suddenly you're getting really attracted to a particular township.
Yeah, and that was Alexandra Township.
Tell me about Alexandra.
You know, I was working very close to Alexandra Township. You know, I'd gone through this terrible marriage, and I'd been advised I must get a job. And so I was working very close to Alexandra. And I used to go past Alexandra. And I'd see the shacks, and I'd see the absolute poverty and the devastation of this township. It stank. It was terrible. And then I thought, well, I've got to do something here. I have to. But what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? I didn't have a clue. And so I thought, okay, I'll take a pot of food, the pap, the maize pap, and I make meat, and I'll sit on the side of the road and I'll just give them food. And it was amazing how I then come to Rhema. And we had a Rhema conference, and somebody came up to me, believe me or not, and said, Annie, do you know why nobody is doing anything in Alexandra Township? So that was the call of God already as I went past that township, cried tears over this township, and had ideas on how to get there. Here somebody said, why is nobody doing anything?
But Annie, can I just ask, what makes a young girl, newly married, with a traumatic past already, imagine that she can actually impact somewhere like Alexandra?
Oh, I didn't think too much of that. I've never... Look, I do look back at times, and I think, my goodness, that I ever did that. But I think when God starts putting you into certain situations, and I've always done that. When he says something, I jump, because I find him to be the God who does what he says. So I jumped into Alexandra Township, which, by the way, I heard only a few months ago being said on TV to be the most dangerous place in the world. I think it's so funny. I didn't even think about it. I wasn't actually really allowed in because I had a white skin. And I needed a permit, but I never had a permit, I never got one. And I went into this township and I had a meeting. We started in a little house with a meeting. And I had, the bread tin was on the table, and that was my pulpit. And God did miracles in that first meeting, but truly miracles. I had one lady who had a third breast here. There was a tumor. That tumor disappeared just like that.
Oh my
there
word!
There were only 9 people, by the way. And there was one man who always said afterwards, he wasn't on the bottle, he was in the bottle with the cork on top of it. God set him free.
Really?
Totally free, right there in that meeting. There was a blind grandmother who gradually began to see. 6 weeks later, she totally saw, but it began in that meeting. And the following meeting, I thought, this room is going to be far too small. And then there were only 6 people.
So it didn't happen all at once.
It didn't happen all at once. But you know what? I went home after I had only 6 people in this meeting. And I said to myself, I am not moved by what I see. I'm not moved by what I hear. I'm moved by the word of God only. And he sent me, and we will succeed in this mission into Alexandra Township. And if we look at it today, well, the churches grew. I planted 2 churches in Alexandra. Those are the biggest churches there today. The other wonderful thing was that somebody actually gave me a plot of land which I could do with whatever I wanted. And then I gave that to one of the churches on which they have built a church.
Fantastic.
That was an amazing period, the Alexandra period. The police were very unhappy with me. The army was very unhappy with me.
I guess you were the only white woman there, were you?
Well, I didn't see.
You weren't aware?
No, I went away. Look, it was only a square mile at the time, this township. I think it was it was a place where people didn't give much attention to. But they needed Jesus. And I could bring them Jesus. And I would have my car full of food stuff, lots of food stuff, I think of it now, which they probably hadn't got a clue what it was, like a tinned salmon and all this kind of thing, which I would get from Woolworth. or what's his Marks and Spencer in South Africa, all this beautiful food I would dish out to the people.
You know, it sounds as well from your book as though you were developing such a kind of a holy boldness. I almost felt sorry for the people who tried to cross you. I mean, there was a guy who tried to steal your briefcase and your car. What happened there?
Yeah, that was one day I'd stopped in the street to talk to someone out of my window that way, and I turned back, and there were 5 guys with big screwdrivers, and they said to me, "Madam, are we taking your car?" I said, "You are not taking my car." "Oh, yes, madam. We are taking your car." I said, "This car belongs to Jesus and you better move." And they moved.
They did.
They moved. In fact, they walked up a little bit further, turned around and waved at me. It was really funny. So that was one time. And another time, I'd established what was called a Kondanani. Now, Kondanani is the Zulu word for loving one another, as Kondanani is the Chichewa word. So I had, and I picked up what was called a Section 21 constitution from the lawyer. And I mean, she'd done all of that for free, and it was quite a big thing. I mean, it could have cost me a lot of money. And I've got that on my seat next to me, my executive case. And out of that window, again, somebody said, "Madam, what's the time?" And while I gave him the time, the other one decided to open that door and get my suitcase, my case. And I thought, not in your life. This is a lot of money worth. I said, "Put it back now." And he got such a shock that he put it straight back. And that was the end of that story.
Oh, I love it.
At another time, I was actually cornered with a gun.
Annie.
But I just looked at him and I said, "What do you think you're doing?"
And yet, I mean, this was such a time of contrast for you personally, because this extraordinary ministry was developing, but meanwhile, you were finding you were trapped in a physically abusive marriage, in which you were forced to have a termination against your will. And you found yourself wrestling with the need to be able to forgive yourself for your eventual divorce and also for that termination, even though that had been forced upon you. And I'm wondering, what eventually enabled you to be able to do that, Annie?
You know, what enabled me to get past the divorce, or the guilt of the divorce, was that my Father, my Heavenly Father, has a way with me. And if he wants to deal with me about something, he kind of puts up his hands and said, "Okay, fine, now it's over. And now we're going to deal with this situation." And I know it. I know it when he does that. And one morning, I opened again the doors of my lounge. That is where I used to have my quiet time. And he said, "Okay, it's over. We are now going to deal with it. And you're going to confess that I do hate divorce. And that it is a sin, whichever way you look at it." You see, I had got myself into a marriage which was not necessarily God's plan for my life.
Okay.
And I had to go onto my knees and I had to say, "Father, forgive me for a divorce. Forgive me for that." And it says that if we ask him for forgiveness, that he cleanses us from that unrighteousness.
And there came a time where you just knew that freedom from guilt.
I knew that freedom from guilt. You know, somebody once saying to me, "Annie," I thought it was amazing, "Annie, if God has forgiven you, who do you think you are not to forgive yourself?"
Brilliant. Brilliant.
And I thought that was, who am I? If God does it, who am I? And I can get past that.
Well, meanwhile, Annie, God TV viewers will be familiar with the fact that your personal story, the story of Kondanani, is very intertwined with the birth of God TV. How did you first meet Wendy?
Wendy was working for my ex-husband for a little while, and Wendy wasn't very happy there. So between the two of us, we kind of had something in common, and we started talking to each other. And Wendy needed a place to stay. And that became my home, where she came to stay. And Wendy stayed in my home for 1.5 years. And there was an amazing time. We had so much fun. We laughed so much. We had hardly got a penny between us, because now I'm divorced already and I've got 4 kids. But it was an amazing time of growing spiritually for both of us. And that is how I came to know Wendy. And then one day, I sent my daughter off to boarding school in Rustenburg. And that lasted 3 days. And then she'd run away. And the pastor there, who she was under his care, phoned me and said, look, she's run away, and that's it. So I thought, well, I better fetch her. And I said to Wendy, you come with. She came with, and then I told the pastor how well she can sing. You know, Wendy can sing beautifully.
I've heard this.
Yeah, well, she hasn't practiced now, but she was a very good singer. And I asked him if she could sing in the church. And they were very happy to let her sing in the church a couple of weeks later. And the Saturday before that particular Sunday, Rory went to his pastor and said, well, God has told me that tomorrow I'm going to meet my wife. And the pastor said, well, what if she's big, fat, and ugly? And Rory says, well, I don't know, but God has said tomorrow I'm going to meet my wife. And for sure, the next morning we met Rory, who was then the worship leader. And he had his eyes on Wendy. But of course, this love affair only grew with Rory's hair growing longer.
Because Wendy had a thing about long hair at the time. I remember hearing that.
Well, you see, he had this army cut. And she did not like that. She did not like that. And Rory really chased Wendy. But praise God, they got together.
Fantastic. And the rest is history.
And the rest is history. It took a while before, of course, the God Channel came into being.
And meanwhile, your own work was absolutely flourishing.
Yes.
And one of the things that comes through strongly in the book, though, Annie, is that you weren't just interested in saving souls. You have a far more holistic interest in the whole of the person, don't you?
Yeah. While I was in Alexandra Township, I began to understand that it was wonderful that these people got saved. It was wonderful that they had Jesus in their lives now. But you know, that's not the end of the story. There is so much more to it. And the poverty was still in their lives. So what was I going to do about helping them to, you know, to go forward, to find something to do which would bring them an income? But, you know, I was a single woman at the time, and I felt that I was under the leadership of the pastor of Rhema, who was at that time my own pastor. And they were very unhappy with me about wanting to do more. Now, they said to me, you know, you're already taking far too many hours in a day to minister in Alexandra Township. Now you want to double it up. And we're in disagreement as far as that's concerned. And I had to let go of that. But you know, later on, of course, Rhema began to understand these issues themselves.
So you ended up doing it your way, but it took a bit of time.
I ended up doing it my way.
Yeah. Well, Annie, I mentioned at the top of the programme there was an attempt on your life. And extraordinarily, that was instigated by the children of your lovely second husband, Louis. Can you just briefly explain what happened and why?
My late husband, he had, he was a very poor pastor at the time when I married him. But that had not always been the case. Louis was a politician. He still had a state funeral, by the way, as being a poor pastor. He was a politician. He was the first black man in Malawi to own a bus company. He was the first black man in Malawi who owned a driving school. He was a pioneer. He was not a poor man to begin with. But then the Lord touched him. He got saved. His late wife, who died in 1990, his late wife became demon-possessed, and very seriously demon-possessed. And during that time, when he saw her becoming free, as a result of one of his children who had got born again and sending a missionary to his wife, she got born again, but he heard the voices of the demons, and he saw them leave her, and as a result, he got born again, and he then went into ministry. And when he got into ministry and started Bible Faith Ministries, the money rolled out of his pocket, and all he was left with was this 50-acre property with this 10-bedroomed home, which had one room which had glasses in the windows, and that is the room we lived in to begin with. The children, who were adults, by the way, because he was 17 years older than me, the children who were adults were under the impression that I would inherit this property, which was not and never was the case. It was very clearly discussed between him and me, and it was never the case. I was not going to inherit that land. But God had a different plan. It was a totally different plan. And they decided that in order to, apparently what they said, what this clever white woman is going to take away our inheritance. So in their minds, I had to die, because that was the only way to get me out of the way. There were lots of things they did prior to that to make my life a misery. But the thing is, if I would have been probably a Malawian woman, I would have ran away. But there were a lot of things which I wasn't going to run away from.
Well, you've been through so much already.
I mean, I'd overcome enough. I wasn't going to run away from anything. No. And then one of the sons of my husband died. He had an epileptic fit while he was sitting on the bush toilet, and he must have tried to get himself up, which he couldn't, and his lip went against his nose, and with all the foam in his mouth, he died. And, so people saw him walking around as a big, strapping young man the day before. Now, the next day, he's dead. So they decided this was a good way of getting Annie Chikhwaza into trouble, because the Malawians, on average, do not see ever death as anything natural. It's witchcraft or it's poisoning. So they said I had poisoned their brother. So they went into the villages, and I know all of this from my late husband, that they had meetings in the villages with the people and said, right, she's killed one of us. We now have to kill her. And you're going to get a piece of this land if you kill her. And there was a day when, in fact, one of my husband's sons said to my husband that if you come back onto this property, this 50-acre property, you will be killed, but we won't do it. The villagers will do it. So the morning of actually on a Sunday evening, when things were really getting out of control, and when I was getting these death threats all the time, I phoned the president of Malawi, who's at that time Dr. Maluzi, And His Excellency said to me, well, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to tell the Inspector General? And I told him, I said, they're going to kill me. They want to kill me. I need protection. And he didn't do anything. I went to the Dutch consulate the next day on the Monday morning, and I said, look, I want my government, my Dutch government, to know that I have no protection, that they want to kill me, and I just want them to know. And that particular afternoon, I had this big mob of people come and surround my house.
Annie, this is an amazing story. We've got this mob coming towards you after your life. So whatever you do, don't miss part 2 of Mother of Malawi, Annie Chikhwaza's inspirational story next time. Thank you, Annie. And for now, thank you for watching and goodbye.